Everyone, this video is a teacher lecture on task 6-3, which examines document, which document is it? Hang on, let me get caught up here. Document A in the Robert Frost DBQ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to go back and talk about some of the things that I marked and highlighted and some things that you'll need to pull from the text. Before I read it, I do want to tell you a little bit about the passage. If you struggled with it, don't feel bad. This is, I think, probably the hardest piece of reading in this assignment. It comes from a book that was written for college students and people who study poetry for a living. So the people who this book was written for are the kind of people who teach about poetry at the college level. So the text is what we refer to as dense. It's challenging. There's a lot of information packed into it. So don't feel bad if you struggled a little bit. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little bigger because I am kind of an old person and I like to be able to see. Okay. Not surprisingly, much of Frost's poetry talk centered on the importance of metaphor. As might also be expected, the best of his comments on poetry are definitions of metaphor or themselves metaphor. For example, Frost spoke of a poem as a napkin going into a napkin ring, with the ring as the poem and the napkin spreading out again for other people. Another time, he used the image of a current carrying the eelgrass with it, combing it like hair. It thus combs it in different directions without unrooting it from its initial clarity, its fixed meaning. What to the poet is his fixed meaning would most probably be to us the words on the page, holding down our readings even as they are pushed and pulled by the currents of possible meaning. A similar swaying metaphor Frost used was that of a boat at anchor. What all of these metaphors of metaphor have in common is an underlying image of radiating, a term Frost also used. Words, metaphors, poems should radiate meanings outward from the words on the page, becoming more than their literal selves, but never at the expense of losing their moorings, coming loose from the actual words and images that anchor them or hold them rooted to the poet's text. So, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in here. These are long sentences. There's some wonky punctuation. And some of the things they're talking about might seem a little foreign. So we're going to go back over this and look at it basically sentence by sentence. All right, so the reason for these brackets is that in the original sentence, the word frost was not there. And so the people who put together this assignment took this passage out of the book, but then changed the word that was here before frost. So most likely it said, not surprisingly, much of his poetry talk in the original text. But because they were using this for a student assignment, they put Frost in there instead of his so that it would be clear from the start who this piece was about. That was an editorial thing that they would have done when they were setting up this assignment. Another bit of punctuation, interesting stuff, are these dots. These are called ellipses. And ellipses is basically 3 periods. And it represents text that has been deleted that was in the original. So there's something in the original text that occurred between of and metaphor, but they took it out for whatever reason. And right here, there was text at the end of the word anchor that they took out. But that 4th dot there is the period at the end of the sentence because you still have to punctuate the sentence. So these 3 dots represent text that has been redacted. It's been edited out. It's been deleted when they put together this assignment. So let's see what else was there. Oh, the parentheses around the S. So again, it's adding that S in there because that sentence, poems should radiate meaning outward. Poems could also radiate more than one meaning. So they put the plural inside the parentheses to indicate that, yes, it could be plural, but it's not necessarily required to be plural. So that's all the wonky punctuation. You should know what metaphor is from the last reading that we did. So I'm not going to worry too much about you knowing what a metaphor is, because at this point you should already know. Apparently it was darker than I thought it was when I took this picture, so it's a little weirdly colored. Okay, so when Frost talked about his poetry, he talked about metaphor in terms of other metaphors. So he used a metaphor to define what a metaphor was. The first example that the author lists is a napkin going into a napkin ring. And I don't know about y'all, but at my house, we ain't fancy. I don't even own napkin rings, much less cloth napkins. But what you're looking at on the screen right now is a cloth napkin that has been put into a napkin ring. And so you can see that in order to get the napkin in there, it would have had to have been rolled up or folded over. And then once it's in the ring, it kind of expands out from that ring. So in the text, it says, Frost spoke of a poem as a napkin going into a napkin ring, with the ring as the poem and the napkin spreading out again for other people. So if you look at that picture, oh, where did the picture go? The ring is the poem, and the napkin are the possible meanings that radiate away from the center of that napkin. So the napkin ring doesn't change, but the napkin will and does. So the idea is that the poem itself doesn't change, but the meaning and the interpretation that we get out of the poem can change and will change, and honestly should change over the years, but that's a whole other poetry nerd conversation. There are two other ways that the author describes Frost having explained what a metaphor is. And the second one is of a current carrying eelgrass with it. Now, basically, eelgrass is a plant that grows in the bottom of the ocean in some parts of the world. And when the currents move, the eelgrass sort of sways in the water. There's a short video attached to the assignment for this piece that shows you what eelgrass is if you're interested in looking at it. But what happens is as the water moves in different directions, so does the eelgrass. And the eelgrass doesn't get uprooted from the water, so that's fixed. But the way that the eelgrass moves changes and shifts around based on the currents. So in that metaphor, the eelgrass is the poem, and the current making the eelgrass move around would be how people interpret the poem. Okay. Now, we talked in the last session about what fixed meaning is, or what literal meaning is versus figurative meaning. And this author uses the phrase fixed meaning, which would be the words on the page, which we taught you is literal meaning. And then the last metaphor that Frost used to describe a poem was a boat at anchor. Now, when a boat is at anchor, it's said to be moored. And the moorings are the things that hold the boat in place. Okay, so weird fact about me, I am really obsessed with like really big natural catastrophes like earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes and tornadoes. So I watch a lot of weird stuff on YouTube. The tsunami video that I've posted with this assignment, if you watch it from the time periods that I left on there and you watch those boats move, those boats are moored to the edge of the river. But as the tide comes in and goes out, and as the water raises and lowers with that tide and then eventually gets sucked away with the tsunami, you see how the boat moves and adjusts to the things that are changing around it. So that boat that is moored in is the poem, and the movement of that boat is how we would look at that interpretation. So the idea is, at least from Frost's perspective, is that when you look at a poem, the words on the page are never going to change. But how we understand those words on the page will change. How you understand a poem now versus how you understand that same poem 5 or 10 years from now are going to be two very different things, because your life has changed, your experiences have changed. Your eelgrass has had waves moving around, okay? So when you read a poem, it's going to be okay if you don't come to the same conclusion that other people come to, because you haven't had the same movement in your life that other people have had. Now, there are some hard and fast things that you can say are wrong when you analyze a poem, but as long as you can back it up and it makes sense with the words on the page, then you can argue a lot of different interpretations of the same poem, because our experiences are moving and constantly changing. All right. Last thing I want to talk about on this is a reading skill. If you look at the last sentence, I have it partially highlighted in green. That is a big behind sentence. It is long. And if you don't break it down, it might be really hard to understand. Okay, so I'm going to read it again with all of it, and I'm going to show you how I broke it down. Words, metaphors, poems should radiate meanings outward from the words on the page, becoming more than their literal selves, but never at the expense of losing their moorings, coming loose from the actual words and images that anchor them or hold them rooted to the poet's text. Basically, what she's saying is that the meaning that you get out of a poem should never be completely disconnected from the words on the page. So you can't just say that a poem's about a purple dinosaur unless there's a clue in the poem that hints at purple dinosaurs. Okay, the words on the page are never going to change. So whatever meaning you get from it can't be at the expense of stepping away from the poet's words. Now, that's a long sentence, and you can break it down into a lot of small sentences. Words, metaphors, and poems should radiate meanings outward from the words on the page. We could put a period here. Okay? They should become more than their literal selves, period. Doing this should not be at the expense of losing their moorings, period. They shouldn't come loose from the actual words and images that anchor them or hold them to the text. And even doing that, it's still a challenge to understand. But if you pick the most important parts of the sentence, you can break it down and figure out what they're talking about. Words, metaphors, and poems should become more than their literal selves. The idea is, in a poem, you're going to get more out of a poem than just the words on the page, but never at the expense of coming loose from the actual words and images. So that interpretation should never completely detach or go away from what the poet actually says on paper. Now, I understand that for a lot of you, that might be one of your first experiences with thinking about how poems have a meaning and how you look at what the poem's meaning is. And if you don't get it, that's okay. This is a hard passage, and we can talk about it in live session, or you can send me an email or text messages with questions, and I will do my best to explain them. But the basic summary is this. There are two ways to look at poetry. You've got the words on the page, which is the literal meaning, and you've got whatever interpretation you come up with. What's the poet really saying? Or what does this poem mean to me? That's the figurative meaning. Those two meanings, the literal words on the page and the one that you come up with, are connected by the words on the page. And that's it. Now, my suggestion is to go back and reread this again and to look at the picture of the napkin ring and to go back and watch the tsunami video of the boats moving. And if you're oddly interested in weird destruction like I am, it's a 40-minute video, but you get to see what the power of a tsunami is. And since half of you have me for science, you're going to have to know what a tsunami is anyway. So it might be kind of cool to watch. Anyway, so that's what I would suggest you doing to help understand this. And when we meet in live session, we can go over it and talk about it some more. So thank you all very much for watching, and have a lovely whatever time of day it is in your world.